Nice. And as far as today's episode, we wanted to focus on one of your favorites and one of my all-time favorites, the GOAT, the 16-time world heavyweight champion, arguably the greatest of all time. I mean, I said GOAT, but arguably people might say different. He probably is if you add it all up, and we'll get into it later even more so. But the Nature Boy, Ric Flair, will be the subject and the topic today. I know you've known him for a very long time. You guys are probably right around the same age. When did you first meet Nate?
I met Nate in 75 in Charlotte. But a unique thing I met actually that was the territory I met him in. And then later on I would meet him in St. Louis when he was, they get ready to, uh, their idea was that he was in the running for the belt, so he went to St. Louis. I was going to St. Louis first from Florida and then from Kansas City. And I was not in the position that Rick was in, but he was terrific. And the funny thing was, I, I got a program someone just showed me recently because I don't keep memorabilia. Uh, I was supposed to wrestle Rick on his first Madison Square Garden show in '76, and something happened that he didn't make it. So I've known Rick forever. Uh, Rick has come down and visited me. I took his kids snorkeling. Uh, I took his kids to see sharks under the water, which they might they might have not really appreciated. Rick and I have had a great time. I've been on the Ric Flair party train, and if you ask me to come up with a story, I can come up with stories of bits and pieces because when you go out with Rick, that's what it is. It's bits and pieces. And I've told you about the greatest story of all times. Aaron, I don't mean to get you in trouble. Aaron, it was a long time ago. It, Double A was going to go to the Hawaiian Islands on a vacation. There's no harder working man in show business than Aaron Anderson. And we used to stay at the Blackstone Hotel, one of the famous hotels in Chicago, free because Rick's best friend's family owned it. And they just didn't own that, they owned every major arena in the country. They were the only family ever taken to court for a monopoly because every heavyweight boxing match from like 32 until Ali and Liston, up until Liston and Ali fought in Lewiston, Maine, was fought in their building. They owned the Blackhawks. They owned the Bulls. They owned the Harlem Globetrotters. And when we stayed there, I mean, it was a glorious hotel. And, Rick got Triple A treatment because Bruce McCarthy was his dear friend. So we go out one night, and Aaron kept on saying, "Well, I ain't going out tonight because I got to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning and be bushy tailed because I'm meeting Aaron in Vegas." So Rick, knowing that was the worst thing Aaron could have done, and it went from Aaron having a beer to triple kamikazes. And when Aaron came back to the hotel room, it couldn't have been planned any better. I would have loved to see this in a movie scene. Aaron got into bed and he said, "I'm exhausted." He looks like a grilled French fry. The grease is coming off him. He lays down in bed, and I swear, no, he had put his head down. The phone rang, his wake-up call, and he had to leave. He was stumbling to find his bag, his shaving kit. It was hilarious. But that was it with Rick. It was when you went with Rick. And the crazy thing was, if you went out with Rick and partied like that, the next day, if you were in Dothan, Alabama, or Pensacola, Florida, or Tampa, or wherever, where it was hot, the next day at 9 o'clock, you were out there doing squats, push-ups. I mean, I'd seen Dr. Tom Pritchard, Doctor, if you listen to me, I know you're going to agree with me, almost pass out. I mean, Rick was the only guy I've ever seen in my life that could burn the candle at completely both ends and want to keep going. He's an amazing, amazing guy. And to me, he's the greatest world heavyweight champion of all times. Rick never took a night off. I've seen him wrestle. We'll get into this later. Steamboat and Funk in front of 20,000 people. And I've also seen him wrestle the late Rufus R. Jones in front of 1,200 people. The matches were as equally violent, equally great wrestling, and equally Rick taking the great bumps. Rick never took a day off, and that was working, being part of the office, and also partying. He didn't take a day off.
That is amazing, though. He can go out and party, and like you said, Dr. Tom, who tells a great story about he's puking, he's dying, all that stuff, and Rick is still running and running and running, and like that's pretty amazing that he can just kind of be in such great shape and has the alcohol and stuff, that doesn't affect him. And Dr. Tom, who was in great shape too, is over there puking his guts out.
Yeah, and Rick had that strong, strong mindset. I mean, Rick, you came from a powerlifting background. I remember the first time I ever saw a picture of Ric Flair. I went up to the office in Tampa, and Dusty was the booker. And like I said, Dusty and I got along very well. And Dusty said, I want to show you a picture of the guy I'm bringing in. It's my brother, Rick Rhodes. And here's a guy with a crew cut. He weighed about 320 pounds. He had been training with Patera, who was one time the first man ever to press 500 pounds. That means clean it, stop at the shoulders, and press it. 500 pounds. So he was training with Kenny, and Kenny was an incredibly gifted athlete. Also, I mean, the whole family. His brother was the coach of the Minnesota Vikings, and Rick was huge. And then, for some reason, he didn't come in. The next thing I saw was a tape from North Carolina where there was a slim down guy called Ric Flair, not Rick Rhodes. I thought, wow, it can't be the same guy. He metamorphosized himself. And I went to Dusty and I said, yeah, is that the same guy? He said, absolutely. And, I was there from the inception of him and Dusty and the ups and downs they had. But even when they're having the ups and downs, they admired one another. And when you have two guys that love the business the way they did and do, there's always going to be a little small disagreements. And, and they're both huge personalities. And some of the matches were the greatest matches I ever saw. And the other thing is, I've never seen Ric Flair. I said he never took a day off. I've never seen Ric Flair have at least a 3-star match. Rick could work with, as we say, a broomstick.
Definitely. Easily one of the greatest of all time. You mentioned 1976, almost wrestling him for the WWF and MSG. The first match I could find of you guys together was 1983 in January for Championship Wrestling from Florida. You were teaming with him versus Midnight Rider, who obviously is Dusty, and Barry Windham. Do you remember that? And was there a match in between?
There was a few matches in between, and I had actually even forgot about it. Somebody brought that up. And how that happened? Do you know? I had beaten Dusty in a lose leave time match. You know, the famous one with Santa Claus, who was Jake, handed me the atomizer and I put Dusty down. And because I had beaten Dusty, Dusty was supposed to get a title shot the following week, I believe, and he couldn't get it. And we had tag matches around, and I can't remember the finish, but I'm gonna say that Rick might have done the job for the Midnight Rider, and Dusty and I came up with a finish where he actually beat Rick in Miami, the Midnight Rider, and he had to give the belt back because he was on suspension, meaning Dusty, and if it was proven that he was the Midnight Rider, he was going to get suspended for life. So the angle was, even though he won, he didn't have to tell anybody or show anybody his face but Geigel. And he refused to do that and had to give the belt back. So I think this might have been leading up to that.
As far as Dusty and Rick, like you said, there's always kind of a professional rivalry. And we got into it a little bit when we had JG on, talking a little bit about how he kind of had to manage both, maybe it has both their egos. Rick is obviously at the top of his game. He's the world champ. Dusty, at the top of his game, maybe wants to be world champ, but also is the booker. So, I mean, there's some conflict there. And also, you have to realize, too, you can't always kill the heels, kill the heels, kill the heels, kill the horsemen. You got to keep them strong, keep their heat. So, what do you think about the relationship between Dusty and the Nature Boy?
First of all, they loved one another. So they were like brothers. And brothers fight. I have a brother and we used to fight when I was younger. And you got two guys, and here's the other thing. Rick got Dusty that job. And Dusty was smart like this. Like when I'm gonna give an example of what he did to me. I was over because of Dusty. He did the job at the right time for me. When I would wrestle Mulligan, Jack never beat me, or if he did, he went out on a stretcher. I was thinking, I was in San Antonio last week, and I thought last time I worked in that area, we were outside in a ballpark, and Mulligan beat me, but I laid the Texas flag on top of him and lit it on fire, and I had a riot. Dusty knew how to keep his heels hot, and Dusty also thought that he would feed you his top baby faces, except Dream was Superman, and rightfully so. Unless you had the right kryptonite, whether it was yellow or red kryptonite, the green kryptonite, you needed that, and probably all three of them to get him down. And there was a little bit of jealousy who was drawing, but without one another, it wouldn't have worked. And as you remember, JJ telling he'd go to Jimmy and be very diplomatic, and he'd tell it's time to invite Rick over, and then it would be explained, and then usually, unbeknownst to both of them, Dusty would be coming over for some reason. Oh, while you're here, let's have a drink. And it was without either one of them. Crockett would never been in the running to even come close to putting Vince in trouble.
Yeah, if you think about it, 1984 Starcade, 1985 Starcade, Flair versus Dusty, both times headlined those big monster cards, and they were the draw, and they made all the money. But if I could rewind to Starcade '83, and it's interesting because you're on the card as well. There, it's Harley Race versus Ric Flair, the Flair for the gold, and Flair's really going to make his name and really become, the Nature Boy that we know and love today, and win that cage match. You were on that card, you and Mark Lewin, if you remember, against Scott McGee and Johnny Weaver.
Yeah, I got a great story to tell you. They came to us and they told us we were going to be in the Summit Mine in May next year, blah, blah, blah. And they said, we want you to get juice on Scott McGee. And Scott McGee had never gotten juice. So Gary says, I'll do it to you, Scott. He said, no way, Gary. And Mark said, well, I'll do it. He said, no way. And he said, the only one that's going to do it is Kevin. And I said, okay. Well, I made a regular blade. As I'm going out, I had put the blade in the bench, and it's time to go to the ring. The blade's gone. Mysteriously, the blade's gone. So I'm panicking. They say, you got to go, you got to go. Hardware him. I'm thinking, oh, no, not doing that. And all of a sudden, when we're coming out of the entranceway, Gary said, here, I think this is yours. Well, it looked like a shark dorsal fin. It wasn't anything I would have used. I mean, it was huge. And Gary wound me up. He said, you got to get it on him and get it quick. And when I did, at first I cut him so bad it didn't open. And then when I did it again, it just poured in his boots and he was screaming, no, no, not enough. So Scott was another guy that never got his due. He was a terrific performer, and that got us over, but it kind of set the tone for that pay-per-view. But Rick and Harley had a match, and that's when I think the wrestling business knew that Ric Flair was here to stay, and he was going to be the most influential athlete in our business for 50 years. I've said this before. In 1989, Jim was going to get rid of him. Tank, the famous story where I tell you, Herb got in a room and said, we want to cut your hair, give you a trident, and put in earrings in your ears. And I said to him, well, why don't we just go to Yankee Stadium and change Babe Ruth's number from 3 to 43. And that was in 89. I watch now where professional football players are in the dressing room and cutting Ric Flair promos, jet flying, limousine driving, wheeling dealing, son of a gun, and they're all doing it in woo. And then Rick's got the Skittle commercials or whatever it is, and Ric Flair is still around, and he still is very relevant today. The problem is they don't know where to stick the stake. He's like Dracula. They're missing his heart. Rick is going to be around a long time, and he's an icon. I don't think, here's what I think is funny, and I don't think a lot of the young kids get this. And this isn't bashing the young kids. I was in San Antonio, and they had some of the greatest matches I ever saw. Mustang Mike and Milo had a match that they just really beat each other up. And during not their match, but before that, guys would be chopping one another, and I'd hear the whole crowd go, woo, woo. So every time, Rick is in every arena that ever runs once they chop. That's how over Ric Flair is. I can't say that, and I love Terry Funk, but I don't hear anybody yelling when they go for a spinning toe hold, or if they even do. But Ric Flair is he is the icon of our business. And I've watched some of. He had a. Did you see the real extended interview with the guy that does? I think the guy may be Persian. He does, Ronnie Coleman. He's done Dorian Yates, and he had Rick on. I mean, I laughed, I cried. It was so emotional, and it's Ric Flair at the very best. And going back in during that time when Rick won his first title, the college kids were coming to the matches dressed like the Four Horsemen. They were heels, but they're the babyface heels, and that's what actually got the NWO over. And we'll get on the most intriguing and the biggest angle I have ever seen. And if you could do it today, you would make so much money. Do you want me to talk about that?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, the Terry Funk angle. We have Funk against Steamboat, right?
Flair Steamboat, yep.
I mean, Flair and Steamboat. But we have them. And this was my finish. I had Lou, Pat O'Connor, and Terry write down if it went the full 60 minutes, we were going to have a judge's decision. Well, Rick was the stone cold heel during that match. I mean, the people were booing him against Steamboat. And then afterwards, you remember the angle? They went to the votes, and Terry Funk had changed his vote and threw it on the ground. In 10 minutes after the building was booing Flair for an hour, and this says a lot about Terry Funk. Terry Funk pile drive Ric Flair, and as they're carrying Rick out, the building gets up and gives him a standing ovation. I don't think I know anybody in today's wrestling or wrestling in general that could be booed for 60 minutes and 5 minutes later get a standing ovation like the greatest babyface of all times. Do you, John?
No, it's pretty impossible.
It's impossible. You just hit the word I wanted to hear. It's impossible. It sounds like we're lying. Go back and watch the tape. Of course, he had Terry, and of course, he had Lou and Pat in the background, but Terry Funk is right up there with Rick, is one of the greatest champions of all times. But it would have been a little bit harder for Terry, because he didn't have young guys wearing sport coats and that kind of thing. Terry Funk was Terry Funk and is Terry Funk. But Rick spent an hour getting booed. And then 10 minutes later, we get a standing ovation, and people are panicking. Is Ric Flair going to be able to wrestle again? To me, that was one of the proudest moments of my career that I came up with that. And it wouldn't have worked if it wasn't for Ric Flair.
Absolutely. And it's just awesome. Like the build up to it's awesome because you're going to have those trilogy of matches. What I say it's the greatest feud of all time or the greatest matches, or maybe I can just say it's my favorite matches of all time. When you got Flair versus Steamboat, you had Chi-Town Rumble 89, you had the Clash of the Champions and that awesome 2 out of 3 falls match. And then you had Wrestle War. And in between there, if anybody could find it, it's on YouTube. There is a 6-star match that Meltzer gave 6 stars to between Flair and Steamboat, Landover, Maryland. I believe it is March of that year. So it's really more than a trilogy, but really on TV and in storyline, it's really a trilogy of matches. Flair wins at Wrestle War 89, and arguably and probably the greatest match of all time. That all those matches are 5 stars, and I feel like the house show match that you can find on YouTube is 6 stars. So I mean, they're all 5 stars and above. They're all amazing matches. They're all great. I don't think anything past it has ever touched it. Anything since has ever touched it. Just amazing. And then you flip the switch, and all of a sudden, Funk is beating the hell out of Flair, and then Flair has a tremendous feud with Funk. It's just unbelievable storyline. And that was you putting that together?
Yeah, that was my finishes. Rick had brought me in right then to give finishes, and Rick let me give all those finishes. But I gotta say this: did you say that Meltzer was giving these big old numbers?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Not today, because I think he's great. He's giving 5 stars to people, right? Now, just now. I was there in Chi-Town Heat where you sit with Rick Muster. Was that his name?
Brad Muster, yeah, football player. Yep.
And I saw him jump up and down for false finishes and to moves they made. I wonder if he does that now when he puts out these stars for different guys. Or has, and this is no disrespect to the younger guys, has the quality of matches gone down that it's easy to give these 5 stars to the matches? Where I'm going with this, the Steamboat Flair and then Terry Funk Flair, if these guys are getting 5 stars, then Terry and Steamboat, Rick and Steamboat, and Rick and Terry should have gotten 7 stars in a continuous matches. You know what I mean? Yep. Nothing they do less than that if you give them 5 stars out now.
I totally agree. Some of the best matches ever. I'll say you could be subjective or whatever, but I'll just say Flair Steamboat is some of my favorites. And then to follow it up with Flair Funk, who tore the house down again, and then Flair is having 5-star matches with Terry Funk, and leading up to the New York Knockout Clash of Champions, which is a 5-star match and an I Quit match, and obviously the great Gordon Soley line. What does he say? He just says 2 words, 5 letters, I quit. So, I mean, just memorable, iconic stuff from Flair. And it's crazy. It's like 89 might have been his best year, which is insane to say because every year is his best year pretty much.
Yeah, and the other thing that people forget, John, I don't know if you remember this, Terry had been working very much.
Movies, right?
Yeah, and he was going to Japan, but I mean, that, 2 weeks here, Japan, Hollywood movies, you remember the TV series had the Cowboy series, whatever it was, where he carried this face. I mean, and then he stepped in, and Terry stepped in, and a beat wasn't lost to have Terry in there instead of Steamboat. And in fact, no disrespect to Steamboat, I think it actually was more intense because nobody knows how to get heat like Terry Funk. When I talk to younger guys and they say, well, how do you get heat? I say, it's real easy. Go watch Terry Funk's matches. And if you can get 1/10 of what he puts out, you're going to draw money. I mean, Terry Funk has drawn, I always say that I believe The Undertaker has drawn more money because he's had the WWE machine than anybody in the history because of the longevity. But next comes Flair and Funk, in my estimations, because they were drawing this money, huge money, back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, 2010, 2020. And they could probably do it, in the 2030s because they're not going anywhere. We got to get the villagers to light the torches and chase them out of the castle. You remember the great Frankenstein scene?
Oh, yeah.
A riot is a horrible thing.
What do you think makes Nate such a good draw? Like you were kind of saying before, when he even was a heel, he's like the cool heel. You think that everybody just kind of wants to be him, like they almost want to live vicariously through Ric Flair?
Brother, when he cuts his promos, These are $900 shoes. Takes his watch, a $5,000 watch or a $50,000 watch, and throws it. He's screaming. The veins are coming out of his head. And he talks about Space Mountain. It isn't just the guys. He has girls chasing him. Are you kidding me? Who wouldn't want to have a beer with Ric Flair? When people ask me, I'm on a real isolated island, and I don't get wrestling questions much because they kind of leave you alone. But the questions I get, what's Ric Flair like, is the first. And the second was, have you ever gone out partying with Ric Flair? And I say, yeah. And the third one is, boy, I'd like to do that. And I said, no, you couldn't. You could. You'd be bedridden for a month if you weren't dead. So, he's legendary. He's legendary. It's like, there are some people, these pseudo-intellectuals that you meet, and they say, if you were going to have dinner, name 5 people you were going to have dinner with. They expect you to come up with, Gandhi, Stalin, Hitler, Well, I think that most wrestling fans would say the first one would be Ric Flair. You're going to have a good time. That's the thing. You're going to have a good time with Rick, and it comes across on TV. You know what I mean? And I don't want to take anything away from the NWO because to me they were the most unique thing in the history of the wrestling business. But what paved the way, the precursor to the NWO, was the Four Horsemen. And the Horsemen really got them over. And the way it was booked during the time, it was the Dungeon against the Horsemen. I told you why I did the Horsemen, and I'll take full responsibility. Why I did the Dungeon, I'll take full responsibility for it. But we would draw our numbers when we were wrestling them, and I would make sure that one of us would be down or 2 of us would be down, and they would come down and pick our bones. And when they kept on picking the Horsemen's bones, including Sting, I'm not going to say except Sting, but including Sting, the WCW was at a huge disadvantage, and they were the nucleus. And again, I've mentioned this before. Nash and Hall were very smart, and when they got to the southern towns, they would put the Horsemen over in the middle of the ring. Hogan, Kidd, Kevin, and Scott would lay down in the middle of the ring and give up the figure 4, Irons move. Everybody would beat them with the move, so they were smart. But they were a precursor to groups of wrestlers. Do you know what I'm saying? I don't ever remember. Do you ever remember a group, anything before the Horsemen that could be like the Horsemen?
Not really. Maybe Georgia had like their, they had the Legion of Doom with Jake and Ellering and Hawk and Animal for a period of time. But yeah, nothing really. Maybe Skandar Akbar, but that might have been around the same time with his little army. But yeah, nothing like the Horsemen as far as talent level. That's for sure.
Yeah, and that's what separates them all, the talent level. Again, we know how great Rick is. But I know people say Arn was great. I've been in the ring with Arn. And I don't think I've ever been in the ring with 2, maybe 3 other guys as smooth as Arn. Then Tully. Tully was a heat-seeking missile. And then to me, then you had Barry Windham. And to me, when I was a heel and in my prime, the greatest babyface I ever worked with was Barry Windham. I would not have gotten over the way I did if it wasn't for Barry Windham. I don't know if you've ever, John, or ever watched Barry when he had the blonde hair and he was lean and he looked like a wide receiver. I'd throw him over the top rope. He wouldn't even grab the top rope. It looked like in a splatter, and girls would just pass out. So, and when I say girls, I don't mean 14 to 20. I mean 14 to 8. I mean 8 to 80. Blank cripple or crazy. He was the man. So they had a great, great package, and everybody could talk, but everybody was a fabulous performer.
Now, Rick always known for having those great promos, memorable promos. Where do you think all that passion comes from? Because I mean, boy, is he passionate in those promos.
He wanted to be the best wrestler of all times, and I believe he was.
There's hardly an argument. I mean, he really is. If people, you can say Hogan and Flair kind of back and forth, but if you ask Hulk, Hulk says Flair is the best ever. So, I mean, it kind of leans towards Nate.
Yeah, and if I had my say to be a third person there, that would have been Dusty. Because as good as Hogan and Flair played off of one another, I don't think it matched the intensity of Rick and Dust. That had gone on a lot longer. You know what I mean? And it was somewhat of it was personal. And when you have personal things, whether you really like the guy or you're other, and like I said, they were like brothers. It ain't gonna be smooth all the time. So even when they were happy and together, they were trying to push each other. And then when they were pissed at each other, they were trying to tell each other a little story on the shoot inside the interview. So they were, I mean, and they drew money everywhere they went. I mean, I remember when Dusty and Rick shot an angle and they had 3 towns running. You would see, and you get a booking sheet and you'd see guys with a big smile on the face that they had 4 of the seven towns with Rick and Dust because you knew your week was made. And that's another thing that people don't understand. When you are working on a card and you're not the main event, you're subject to the guy on top to bring it home. And when you were on a Ric Flair card, you knew you were getting paid. Because Rick was also good to making sure the guys got paid that were on his cards. I mean, not many guys did that in his day. Dusty did it too. If you thought you were on their card and they kind of handpicked you to be on their card, if you thought you were shorted, you could go to either one of those guys and it would 98% of the time be rectified. And if it wasn't, there was a good reason for it.
As far as Rick, and obviously he drew a ton of money. Who would, like you mentioned, always drew money if you were on that card, and drawing money and stuff like that. But I'm kind of wondering backstage, was he a ribber? Does he like ribs? Is there any rib stories involving Flair, or is he much more of a kind of partier and not much of a ribber?
He was a partier, but he loved other guys ribbing. Rick knew that if he would rib, it would come back on him because he had Arn, who was brutal. You know what I mean? I love Lex Luger, but I remember the funniest line I ever saw. Arn and him were jousting, and Arn said, "Wait a minute, you need to brush your teeth." And he pulled out a big scrub brush for your back. That was it. You know what I mean? Luger never recover from that. Horse teeth. I mean, you couldn't beat on. So, I don't think. But Rick would die laughing because he loved the camaraderie of the guys too. And everybody liked to hang out with Rick. Rick had a unique personality.
Were you a big drinker with the Nature Boy?
Nobody's a big drinker with the Nature Boy. I mean, I would go out and party with Rick, but Rick was Ted Williams at batting and drinking, and I was Rudy Kazootie, and the rest of us were too. I mean, I've never seen anybody with his capacity. I've been with Rick, and he's walked into a place. There was a very diner in Buckhead that everybody used to go to. All the athletes that played in the Atlanta teams were in there, and I would see Rick walk in and say, double, 100 double kamikazes, and he'd pass it out to people, and that wasn't the only order he would have, you know what I mean? And, I saw Rick put a lot of people to bed.
Love it. He,
As well.
yeah, he's definitely known. I think that's one of the things that everyone always says about Flair too. Like, huge party animal, but somehow makes it to the show, and the main event still puts on a 5-star match and still doing that. What do you think about like other people like around him and kind of having to deal with him? Was that a hard thing to do, or is it much more fun and playful?
When you're, uh, here's what I often say. When we started to do the Great American Bash tours, I think the first year we were on 72 towns in a row, and we were flying private. When we got to the West Coast, we settled in Vegas, so we would fly to L.A. back to Vegas. We would fly to San Jose, back to Vegas. We would fly to San Francisco, back to Vegas. We do about towns in California, then we do Portland, fly back to Vegas. Seattle, back to Vegas. Spokane, back to Vegas. Tacoma, back to Vegas. And what happened was, it was a constant thing, and it's like being on a record player, John. You don't know, you're just going along with it. And I remember the last day, I think we are in Kansas City, and people were so tired and they were just falling apart. And we had a day off getting into Kansas City because it was the last day. And during the trip, everybody's laying back and they're exhausted. Rick is up with a robe on, nothing else, dancing the aisles, starts a party, and everybody's blotto by the time we land and we go to the hotel and start again. Rick is he's the he's the Energizer Bunny with the nuclear battery in it. He's just nonstop.
They always say with him and traveling around and stuff, he'd have the robe and nothing else on. He's very
Yeah,
proud of himself, right? He had a lot of stuff to be proud of, if you will.
we were one of the times Rick and I. It was me, Rick, JJ, and I'm not sure if it was on. There was one other guy from the Crockett's, and we were going because Mantell was running. David Manning, rather, from Dallas office, was running St. Martin, and uh, what happened was we went down there, but Rick and I and JJ flew first class to Puerto Rico, and then from Puerto Rico we flew to St. Martin. Well, we had the same crew that landed in Puerto Rico that were going on to St. Martin. Well, Rick had lit them all up, and we had an hour layover. And Rick goes up with the pilots. Rick had walked out with just the robe on, doing his dance with his shoes on. While we're sitting there, here comes the pilot with the robe on, naked too. I thought, oh God, man, this guy's going to drive us over the Bermuda Triangle. You know, there's a pilot naked dancing with Rick. I'm thinking, oh God, man, there's no stopping Ric Flair. You know,
And the thing with him is, he's such a big star. He's such a big icon, but he would lose a lot, and like in your head, you're thinking, okay, if the guy loses a lot, you're going to remember that, and he's going to be maybe not as remembered. For some reason, he put so many guys over, but you never really remember him. It's weird. It's like he lost the match mentally, but you never really looked at it like that. It was always like he still was Ric Flair. It didn't matter how many times he lost. So he'll put over Sting, a bunch, and Sting will become a super duper star because of that. But he's still putting the guys over. So did you ever see him ever have not a problem putting guys over, but ever say like, hey, I'm Ric Flair, I should be winning more or something. But he put over so many guys in his career. It's crazy if you really think about it. Hogan never jobbed that much, hardly ever. Flair used to job quite a bit.
And the thing about Rick was, and I think this was one of his strong points of this interview, he never talked about losing. And when he got on the interview, it was, well, I took care of him and blah, blah, blah. And you'd say, that son of a bitch, he's a liar. He got beat. And Rick never acknowledged that he would get beat. And I think that was a key for him to be able to do jobs. And you mentioned Sting and Flair. I was there on the first one, Clash of Champions, 45 minutes. And I suggested that to Rick. I said, this kid is going to be a star. And Rick jumped in both feet and made him a star. So if you ever needed a number on a Clash of Champions or a pay-per-view or even a television program, it takes a lot of weight off a guy's shoulders when he puts two names and you know you're going to have the biggest number you got for 6 months with no angle.
It's crazy when you think about it. Like, wow, like he could go in there, like you said, like that. Really put over Sting. He didn't lose at Clash of Champions, but 45-minute draw really put him over. And Great American Bash 90, which is one of my favorite matches, he puts over Sting, and look at that. Sting becomes a megastar after that. So it's just the power of Flair and him knowing, like, hey, if I lose to this guy here, it's really going to get this guy over. I mean, he did it all constantly, over and over, for so many different guys.
Right, right. And that's the ability it takes. And when Rick, well, he was 16 times world champion. So that means you got beat 17 times because he lost the belt. And Rick would go into territories when there was territories. When Rick and I first started, there was 37 territories. And not everybody that Rick would wrestle would be top caliber guys. It was just some guys with gimmicks. And, he would go in there and be able, I hear a lot of people say, well, his matches are the same. No, they're not. He has routine for certain ways that certain guys wrestle. Like he has a routine, we'll say, for the Briscoes because they do a lot of wrestling. If he was wrestling Bruiser Brody, which he wrestled Brody a mini hour probably, it was completely a different match. Abdullah would be a completely different match, but it was similar to the Brody style. He knew what got guys over, and I was lucky enough to be in the ring with Rick, and when I would wrestle Rick, I came out of the ring in much better shape than I did going into the ring, and we had a little routine going too because I was a gimmick heel and he knew how to get the best out of me. And, he was. And the other thing about Ric Flair that a lot of people don't know, he knew how to judge talent. The, I have about four or five people that really know how to judge talent. The first one was Eddie. The second one was Jim Barnett. Terry Funk and Rick are on that. So there's four. So I guess there's four guys that knew when they saw talent first time, this guy is money. And that's a unique thing to have is Rick could draw money, he could talk, he could be a baby face, he could be a heel, and he could be, like we said earlier today, he could be a heel, and 10 minutes later he could be the biggest baby face in the building after they booed him out. He just had the feeling of this business. I never met Buddy Rogers, but Mark Lewin was a dear friend of mine, and we were tag team partners. He would tell me about Buddy, and it seems to me, I think it's apropos, that Rick became the nature boy from Buddy because they had a lot of the same attributes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like with him being the nature boy and like that character and being, living up to the nature boy, he really had like the ultimate it factor. It's one of those things. It's like you can't totally describe it. You can't totally tell, but it's like when you see Flair, you're like, okay, that guy's a star. Even non-wrestling fans, they would be like, well, who is that charismatic guy? Like that guy is a star. I mean, that's Flair to a team. He's the nature boy. He's the it factor.
Right. And like you said, people today know who Ric Flair is, who are big wrestling fans.
Yeah.
He's on TV programs, he's on the news. I mean, he's part of our culture in the United States.
And he may be more popular now with all these rappers who were very young when they were watching Flair, and now they're growing up and they're older and they have a voice and they're proclaiming their love for Flair. They have the Ric Flair Drip. They got songs about him. They're having him in music videos. So, which is insane to say because he's one of the most popular wrestlers of all time. He might even be more popular now. And then he's got a documentary on ESPN which was off the charts, awesome. So I mean, it's right. I mean, he may be more popular now, which is insane to even think.
And I agree with you all the way, JP, that he is, I believe he's more popular now than at the height of his run with the Four Horsemen. He has become, when I saw those football players, and I think it was the Atlanta Falcons, cutting his promo, I mean, that told me something. And, good luck to Rick. He deserves these work very, very hard.
He is absolutely unbelievable. There's no doubt about it. When you look at wrestling history, you got the Flairs of the world being the greatest, the Hogans, but they're kind of neck and neck. And I always enjoyed their feud. I feel like their WWF feud wasn't as good as their WCW feud for whatever reason. But when Flair helps bring Hogan into WCW, obviously it changes the wrestling landscape, changes everything. But Hogan, has gone on record at saying he didn't trust many people at that point. He was just getting over the steroid trial. He trusted Flair, so he wanted to have that feud with him. And if you go back and watch those matches, I mean, they hold up so well. They're so great. He made Hogan look like $1 million in a time where Hogan hadn't looked that good in a while.
Yes, I think that the other thing is Rick made Hulk Hogan again because if you look back then, Hulk had lost about 60 pounds. You remember that?
Mm-hmm.
He didn't look like the Hulk Hogan of old, but you didn't notice it because Rick camouflaged it. And people say that Hogan can't work. He can work. It was just that Rick brought the best out of him and he could relax with Rick. So I think, there's another thing that people don't get Rick credit for. He made guys look good.
And made good guys look better.
Yeah, good guys look better. That's great, great line.
With him, if you just like look at like his history of feuds and stuff, like I love the Hogan feud. Obviously, there's so many great matches that they have, especially Bash of the Beach '94, Havoc '94 is great. I mean, obviously they would have many other battles years and years later, even going into '99. Then the Hulkamania tour in the 2000s. I mean, they were feuding forever. Even in TNA, they were feuding. But one of my favorite feuds, and I don't know if you'll agree or not, but I always loved in WWF and WCW when he feuded with Macho Man Randy Savage. There was something about those two. They just had amazing chemistry, and it was weird. It was like obviously on screen, I doubt it off screen, but it's like they almost seemed like they really hated each other. They seemed like the polar opposites of one another. But when they clashed, that was such a great feud in WWF and WCW.
I agree with you. I wasn't there in the NWA, I mean the WWF, but for WCW, they had an intense. And the thing is, I thought it worked because both their interviews were so intense, and they matched up physically very good. I always say to a lot of this, John, what is this main event going to look like on a poster? Like Brock and Goldberg. Then you go down Randy and Rick. That looks great on a poster. You know, I always, in my mind, like the idea of a boxing poster. What does this look like for a world title match? And they really matched up well.
Love that feud. It's just so good. Then obviously you added Miss Elizabeth, and you throw in some personal issues, and you would believe it. Like, oh, Flair would steal her. He would probably get her and sleep with her. Like you believed it as a fan.
Right, right. Well, I think we've covered Rick pretty well, huh?
Oh yeah, for sure.